right side of the page, just in the questions, just type your name or your city, where you're from, and also how many are with you. Today, our presenter is Sherry Tomlinson. Sherry Tomlinson is a curriculum specialist with McGraw-Hill Education, and she's been with McGraw-Hill for about 10 years. Before that, she was a special education teacher in both Illinois and Florida. She does presentations across the country at conferences, state and regional, and she also supports implementations, doing teacher training, coach training, administrator training to help folks with their implementation. So Sherry brings a wealth of knowledge to our presentation today and to share with you. And again, as she's talking, please feel free to take a moment and ask questions too as she's presenting. It looks like we got a good group of people here from Florida, North Carolina, New Jersey, Washington State. Wonderful, great group of folks here, and we're excited to have you. So Sherry, I'll let you take it away from here.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining me, whether it's the evening around dinner time or if it's the afternoon for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We're going to be talking about boosting comprehension in your reading mastery lesson. So I first want to start, excuse me, I first want to start with a quote from a reading mastery teacher, and it says, "When I think about reading mastery, I think comprehension, comprehension, comprehension. I'm preparing students for success. The comprehension skills in my class are amazing. My students have stronger skills than other classes I've taught. We ask questions throughout the story, look for detail and understanding. Reading Mastery Signature Edition really teaches them to do all these things from a young age." And I hope by the time you finish with this webinar, you'll really feel that you'll have an understanding of how to boost that comprehension in your classrooms as well. So let's go ahead and begin. Now in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the group reading design, and that's the story reading formats in levels K, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're also going to be talking about how to boost the fluency and comprehension in your lessons, and then of course how to ensure mastery with your students. Now before we officially begin, I'd love to go ahead and do a quick poll question.
The first poll we wanted to ask you today is about the story reading formats. The question is, the story reading formats for each level are only a guideline for how you should teach your group reading lesson. Please select true or false. Let's take a few moments for you all to select your answer. This just helps us get an idea of where everyone's coming from today. About half of you have voted so far, so you take a moment, just click your answer. So far, we're about 2/3 of the way there, 80%. I'll give you another 5 seconds before we wrap this up. All right. Well, Sherry, we have about 75% said false and 25% said true.
Well, that is great because the answer was false. So the formats that you see in your lesson are not just a guideline. They are actually the way that this program was designed, and it's really based on that research that we know is really good instruction for reading and pushing our students to have better fluency and comprehension. So way to go, those of you who said false. Let's go ahead and start and look at some of the formats here. Now there are 4 different story formats that are used in levels K and 1. Now here's an example of the first format, format number 1, that's used only in level K. And some of the things I want you to notice here is that in this format, we're tapping or signaling for each of the sounds. Also notice that after we do that, we're asking our students to say it fast with a signal, and then yes, what word, and they're repeating it. Now, this is really important, so as your students are doing this, it's important to do the signal for each of these sounds. For example, rat. What word? Rat. So you're really signaling for each one of those sounds for them, and then when you want them to do the whole word, you do the signal as well. Now, the other piece that I want to show you is that in all of our reading formats, we always do a second reading. And that second reading is really to make sure that we increase that fluency, and in turn we'll have better comprehension of the story. So in that first reading, we're really trying to correct those decoding errors. And in that second reading, we want that fluency rate to be a little bit faster because it's their second time reading it. And then therefore, they'll have a better comprehension of what they're reading. Now, as we look at format 2, some really big changes occur here, and this is happening towards the end of level K. Now, this is coming from their storybook, and remember that all those stories in level K are read twice. Now you might also notice those check marks in the script. That is to check to make sure your students are either following along in their workbook, or as they get towards the end of level K, they're following along in their storybook. Now in this first reading, this is really to make sure our students are decoding accurately, like I said earlier. And again, that second reading emphasizes the understanding of the text. Students should also be more fluent on the second reading, and you'll see that as you really progress and follow these formats the way they were written. You'll see that the story reading exercises have changed, and that students, again, are not reading this with sounding out first, but look at this. They're reading the fast way the first time. But notice what we're doing. Do you see where it says pause for 3 seconds? What that means is we want to give enough time for your students to be able to sound it out in their heads if necessary, so that when you ask them what word, they're able to give it to you on the signal. But put that pause in as it's appropriate for them. Another piece that you may want to do is on your second reading when you start to ask questions. Here you can see that your students are asking, you're asking them the questions and they're reading it. But what you want to remember is as you're asking the questions, you want to use some helpful hints for the kids to know what to do. So they're tracking in their books, and when you're ready to ask the question, you could say, fingers freeze, eyes on me. That means your students freeze on the word that they're reading. You're ready to ask them a question, so you want their eyes on you. And then you can ask them the question. When it's time to go back into the story, their little finger is holding the spot. And that's a really good strategy to use with our kids when we're stopping them in the middle to ask some questions. Now, as we go ahead and we look at our next format, Format 3, you can see here that the teacher signals for students to identify the word for the title and also for the first 3 sentences only. And that's really important. We don't want to follow this, this format here through the whole story because your kids aren't ready. They're past that. They're ready then to start reading it independently. As you can see in the next step, after the first 3 sentences, you'll call on them to each read 1 sentence. And remember, you're going in a random order and having them read 1 sentence at a time. Now, in your script, it'll tell you when to adjust that to have them read 2 to 3 sentences. But in the beginning here, we want them just to read 1 sentence at a time. And that'll also help with their frustration level because this is what's appropriate for them on how many sentences they should be reading. In our fourth format here for levels K and 1, your students read the title together, and students take turns reading aloud individually from the first sentence to that circled 5. And when students make 5 errors or less, the teacher rereads that section and will ask questions. Students then read from the circled 5 all the way to the end of the story, and the teacher asks comprehension questions. Now, if students do not read within the 5 error limit, they need to reread that first section again, and that's really important. Again, that's going to help their fluency and in turn help their comprehension. So it's really important to be mindful of the errors that you hear, and if it's more than 5, then you need to go ahead and make sure they're rereading. That's how we can ensure mastery. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happens when they are reading and they do have an error. This is our chart here, and I'm going to model this for you, that when a student misses a word, you want to stop them and say, listen, that word is because. What word? Your students respond with because. You affirm that. Yes, because. And then the delayed test is really important. You want them to go back and read that sentence again for a couple reasons. The first reason is to make sure they really did, they know how to read that word, because. And then the second reason is because now you're not going to stop them. They're going to read it, and hopefully they'll read it fluently, and they'll be able to understand what they're reading because you didn't stop them to make the correction. So that delayed test is really important when correcting errors. Now, our format for second grade, again, all stories are read twice. Now, on the first reading, the students read the entire story aloud and watch for the error limit. Now, for this particular story, the error limit is 11. Now, on some occasions, you, the teacher, may be directed to ask a few questions. In particular, it may be about predictions about what will happen in the story. Questions to be asked on the first reading will be preceded by a small number 1. If the student stays within the error limit for that story, then the teacher will reread the entire story to the students and will ask the remaining comprehension items with the small number 2. So if students do not stay within the error limit on the first reading, they must reread the story again and only answer the number 1 questions. So remember, the questions with the number 1 are during the first reading, and the questions with the number 2 are done during the second reading that the teacher is doing. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the types of questions that you'll be asking. There are group and there are individual. Now with the group questions, these are designated by the word signal. And you will see often that it's used with the term everybody. That everybody was goat fast on land. That word everybody really signals to your students that everyone's going to answer and for them to be on task. And then notice you give a signal and everyone will answer that question together. The questions that are done individually look like this, and it'll say call on a student, and it says ideas. I often remember this one because individual and ideas both start with the letter I, and that kind of reminds me, oh, I need to call on a student here to read. Remember, we want to ask the question and then call on the students. The reason for that is because we want to make sure that all students are paying attention and ready to answer your comprehension question. Again, it keeps them on task. So just remember, when we're doing the individual questions, you'll see the word ideas, and if you see a group question, you'll see the word signal, and usually it starts with the word everybody. Now you may be wondering what those little purple letters and the purple ovals are for. Now those are the comprehension question abbreviations, and you can see the guide that's on your planning pages in your teacher presentation book. And each question in the Reading Mastery lessons is labeled with what type of question it is, whether it's cause and effect, main idea, or fact and opinion, just to name a few. And those are extremely helpful when you're working with special education students, and maybe you know certain students working on main idea. You can make sure you ask the main idea questions specifically for that student to help reinforce their IEP goals and objectives. Now, something else I want to talk to you about is what happens when our students miss those comprehension questions. Well, first let's look. If you ask a question and they give a correct response, you praise the student, then you move on to the next question. But what happens when they give the wrong answer, or sometimes, they just shrug their shoulders. They don't know. Well, many teachers will then say, okay, who else can answer this question? They move on and they call on a different student. But I want you to don't let them off the hook. I want you to not let those students off the hook. I want you to, when they give an incorrect response or they don't know the answer, model for them how to look back into the passage and find the answer in the text. Then you ask the question again, and you call on that same student that you called on the first time and support them for them to be able to give the right answer. And then you praise them as needed. Remember this, don't let them off the hook. It really does teach them how to go back into the story and find the answer. Now let's shift over and look at the formats that are used for grades 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And again, these are very similar formats. Now, this also happens towards at the beginning, at the end of level 2, So at the end of grade 2, it starts to kind of look like the grade 3 format. And again, that's to help our students transition to the next level. So here, students will read most of the story aloud. Now, the teacher will present comprehension items as they read. And there is an error limit for the oral reading portion to the simple representative in that level. Now, here you see a diamond shape, and this is for level 4. Now, students will read the remainder of the story silently, and the teacher will ask oral comprehension questions related to the silent reading portion. The silent reading portion gets longer as the students advance to the different levels. So let's go ahead and wrap up some of the group reading techniques that we've talked about. The first thing I want you to understand is that your students are reading about a character and a set of stories that span over multiple lessons. For example, in grade 4, they do The Wizard of Oz, and that story goes through many different lessons. And it's in those lessons that they're incorporating facts, rules, and perspectives. I want you to also remember that there's an error limit for the stories. Remember the one I showed you earlier had an error limit of 11. What that means is that we ask 98% accuracy to ensure fluent readers who are comprehending. So when we have that error limit, that's based on the number of words in the passage, and that's coming back to be a 98% accuracy. We really want to make sure our students have high accuracy, so in turn it helps their fluency and comprehension. Another thing I want you to remember when you're calling on your students for individual turns, whether it's for questions or whether it's to have them read different sentences, remember to go in a random or unpredictable order when you're calling on them. Also remember that at the beginning you'll only call on them to do one sentence, but later you'll adjust it to call on and they'll read 2 to 3 sentences at a time. And that's really important to follow that because we don't want our students to hit the frustration level. And again, we always want to remind our students to track. It's really important for them to be able to know where they are when they're reading in case you call on them, but also just to help with the on-task behavior. Now, what I'd like to do is just remind you again that the procedures for all of these levels are detailed in the script in your teacher presentation book. And now let's pause for just a second and go ahead and do another poll question.
The second poll has to do with comprehension. We'd like to know which of the two is the best predictor of strong comprehension. We know both of these help support comprehension, but which one of these two is the predictor of strong comprehension, fluency or word recognition? We're about 56% of the way through. We'll do another 10 seconds or so. Get your votes in. We are right about, we'll stop it right there. We have about 71% said fluency and 29% said word recognition.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Actually, fluency is the right answer. They're both indicators of good comprehension, but really fluency is a strong predictor of how well students are going to be comprehending. That word recognition is really just a piece of that decoding puzzle there. So I want you to imagine a bridge, and that bridge represents your fluent readers. And it's a connection between word recognition and comprehension. You see, a fluent reader will focus most of their attention on comprehension. The more attention that readers have to give to try to identify the words or decode the words, the less attention they have to give for the comprehension. So we really want our students to be strong decoders, and in that first reading, make sure we correct them so that in that second reading they can really focus on the comprehension. And again, this is something that really develops over time through lots of practice. And practice is what they're going to get in the Reading Mastery curriculum. But why is this so important? You see, fluency really does need to be acquired before your readers can move from learning how to read to reading to learn, to taking it to the next step and to dig deep for facts. They really need to have solid learning to read skills, foundational skills. And also understand there's a correlation between that fluency and comprehension, and it's well documented. You see it every day in your classrooms when you work with your students. And again, it's more closely related to comprehension than word recognition. That word recognition is just a piece, like I said, a piece to the puzzle. It really is trying to help them. When they are fluent readers, they can really spend the rest of their time really comprehension, understanding that story. Now, we talked a little bit about practice and how students need lots of practice to be able to become strong readers. So I want to talk for just a minute about paired practice. Now, your paired practice occurs immediately following the main story reading in levels 2 through 5. And students work in assigned pairs, and they do try to sit close together. It really helps the transition into paired practice. Now, students should read from their own textbook so that their partner can follow along in their own textbook. You'll see in the passages symbols such as stars, diamonds, flowers, and those are used in the student text to designate a student's reading segment so they know where they begin and then where they end. And then the partner will know where they begin and end in the story. And also remember, paired practice does not occur in a lesson that contains a reading checkout. Now, a lot of teachers will ask me, how do I get that routine of partner reading or paired practice? How do I get that set in my classroom? So I wanted to share with you a little secret here. There is a book called Core Lesson Connections, and in this Core Lesson Connections book, it gives reminders and lessons for daily fluency practice. It really stresses to have the teacher assign partners, and if you can, have the kids stay partners, for the whole school year, at least for part of the semester. It really does help them build a rapport with one another. And again, remember, these partner readings or paired practice occur after the main story. Now, in this Core Lesson Connections in Appendix E, it gives sample lessons of scaffolded support for you, the teacher, to set up these routines. It gives 10 lessons of scripted, formats of how to set it up, how to get your partners, how to explain to the students, what they're going to be doing when they read with their partner. And it really is a useful tool that not a lot of people know is out there. So I highly recommend using the Appendix E of your Core Lesson Connections book. Now, since I brought it up, let's talk a little bit about that Core Lessons Connection book. Now, whether you're using Reading Mastery as your core reading program, and then you're just using the Core Lesson Connection book to help supplement to, hit your state standards, or maybe you're using the Core Lesson Connections book to differentiate your instruction, understand that this book extends your Reading Mastery lesson. You see, these lessons expand on vocabulary and comprehension, and many times you're using your story reading book that you've used during your group lessons. And because you're focusing on that vocabulary and comprehension, you're allowing your students to dive deeper into before, during, and after reading activities. Now here you see a narrative story map, and this is one of the many graphic organizers that we have in the Core Lesson Connections book. But what this does is this allows you, the teacher, to lead into writing instruction with your students by, using that same story that they've had access to in your group reading lessons. So let's go ahead and recap a little bit about how we can boost comprehension with our students. Now, the first thing you want to remember is really follow that script. Remember, it's not just a guideline. It truly is, research proven way of really helping our kids achieve high levels of mastery to then, increase their fluency and comprehension in the reading formats. I also want you to listen carefully for those decoding errors and for comprehension question errors. You really want to be able to correct those immediately and follow the tips that we've given. You want to make sure your students know how to go back in the text and find the evidence to support their answers. And again, how to increase that fluency, rate, accuracy, and prosody. Have that partner reading practice daily. And again, make sure you're using that Core Lesson Connections book as a resource for you. Now, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou, and it goes, "Any book that helps a child to form a habit of reading, to make reading one of his deep and continuing needs, is good for him." And that means that we have to start at the young ages and the lower levels, and we have to teach our students how to read. And really, hopefully, through some of the great stories that we have in Reading Mastery, we can really help bring that love of reading to life for them. What I'd like to do now is open it up to questions that you may have about how to boost some comprehension in your Reading Mastery lessons.
Thank you, Sherry. Mary, I know you're watching the question line. Do you have some questions over there for us?
I do. I have a couple. And then if anybody has any else, you can type them in the chat box or the question box, either way. Sherry, the first question has to do with the correction procedure that you had up on the screen. And the question is, do you have students, the question was, do you have students spell or not spell during that story reading error?
Oh, that is a fabulous question. That spell step is what's appropriate during our word attack portion of our lesson. We want to stop and we want to do that spell step then because it's really having our students focusing on the letter arrangement within a word. But while we're in that story reading is really where we want to focus on fluency and comprehension. So we want our error corrections to be quick and to the point. So when we're in story reading, we want to stop, tell them the word, have them repeat it, and don't forget to give the delayed test to have them read the sentence again. That's an excellent question. I get asked that a lot. Thank you.
Okay. And the next one had to do with if students, what do you do if students miss the error limit the second time? So when you're going back and reading the second time, what are you supposed to do then? Or how many times do you reread?
That's a really good question too. You can have some choices here. If you've got a group that you feel can handle it, you go back and you can read it a third time. But let me give you a little tip to help with that. One of the things is if you see this as a pattern, they're continually, not making it at the first reading, they're not making it at a second reading, that tells me that we really need to look at some of the data, and we need to make sure that you're spending enough time during the word attack section of your reading mastery lesson. Sometimes if we rush through too much during word attack and when they're supposed to be practicing those words in isolation, if they're not strong there, when they see those words in the content of the story, they're still not going to get them. So you kind of do a little self-reflection and decide, do I need to spend a little bit more time, in my word attack section? But understand, if you have to do it a second or third reading, that's okay. Another tip I have, though, is keep a little list of the words that they keep missing. And before you do that second reading, say, hey, class, these are 5 or 6 of the words, or however many it was, that we struggled with. So go ahead and, you can kind of review that word list before they do it a second reading. It's okay to practice with them before they're tested, with that second reading or third reading on the error limit. So those are 2 things I'd like for you to look at.
Okay.
Is there another question,
Sherry?
Mary?
Yep. And
okay.
It was about the signal in the primary grades. What types of signals can you use? I think they heard you clapping, okay. And they were just wondering what types of signals can you use for those students.
Right. Okay, great. So because we are talking about story reading or group reading, remember that means our students are looking down, whether at the kindergarten level they're looking down at a worksheet, or maybe in the upper grades they're looking down at a storybook or textbook. So because their eyes are looking down, we need to give an audible signal. Okay, so when you give that audible signal, it can be a snap, a tap, a clap. I am a creature of habit, and I like to tap with a dry erase marker. That's my signal. Now remember, when students are reading individually, you don't need to give them a signal. You let them read at their own pace. But when you're doing some group sounding out, especially at that lower levels in kindergarten and beginning of 1, and you want the whole group to read it together, you need to give an audible signal. And that's your choice of what type of audible signal.
Okay. And the other question has to do with if there's a comprehension error when after you've done the silent reading section and you're asking the oral questions, what happens if an error occurs there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because remember I gave you that cute phrase, fingers freeze, eyes on me, but in the silent reading we really can't do that. So just understand, as a teacher, you may need to give a little bit more support and help the students redirect them into the specific paragraph or section of story where they can find that answer. It just means a little bit more direction from the teacher. And again, we eventually want to kind of scaffold that support away so the students can do it independently. But understand, in that silent reading section, you may need to kind of direct them into, a part of the story or a paragraph of the story to help support them.
Okay. And looking, any other questions out there? I'm just checking the box, Sherry.
Okay.
It looks like that's all the questions for this evening.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Mary and Sherry. Excellent. Thank you all for attending the webinar today. We do appreciate you taking the time to join us and to learn a little bit more about reading mastery and how you can tune up your lessons a little bit. Tomorrow